All right, so we're going to talk about the next Aldo's tool, the match, and you'll notice that this lecture is going to be a good bit longer than the other ones. We also are going to spend a lot more time on this tool and talking about it in the field. And the reason that we are spending so much time on the match is because it's such a critical part of the way that so many ecosystems in the southeast have evolved. That fire has been a critical part of their evolution. In fact, you're looking at fire in pines right here. You can see the black charring on the pines. They've been repeatedly burned, like this graduate student is doing here. And fire, it's shaped the way these communities function and the adaptations of the plants. The pines themselves have bark on them to protect them, to buffer that heat from the cambium, right? The needles are elongated and have secondary plant compounds that promote fire. All of these things are part of the system and the adaptations from fire, and a lot of the things that we are trying to accomplish in wildlife habitat management are augmented by the use of fire. So let's talk about that more and what I'm talking about. Okay, so if we integrate it with the axe, notice here we have thinned a stand down. This was a timber stand improvement practice. We were thinning, right? So the idea here is not to regenerate a new forest, but to get the basal area low enough that we're getting a lot of sun in here. And this is about 50% sunlight getting in. Look how developed the understory structure is. And we have re-entered the stand over the course of about 10 years and burned it about every 2 or 3 years. So we've maintained this luscious understory structure for a long time after that thinning. If we didn't have fire in that system, we would have seen that grow up, all that vegetation would grow up into the mid-story within just about a 10-year period. All right, so let's look at a different type of timber stand improvement, and this is in upland hardwoods. And you remember when we talked about this previously, there's not much vegetation in the understory. So what we're trying to accomplish pretty often for many wildlife species in this scenario is to use forest stand improvement practices or timber harvest or both to create a woodland structure. All right, so you've heard me say woodland and savanna a couple of times throughout these lectures, and you'll hear those terms a lot throughout this class and your career. And let's talk about what those are for a minute. So woodland is basically an open canopy or a broken canopy forest that's supporting a luscious understory vegetation structure that serves the purpose for a lot of open forest species, like we've been talking about, species of conservation concern. That sounds very similar to savanna. All right, so a savanna would be a low basal area forest stand with a herbaceous dominated understory strata. All right, so a key difference between a woodland, from a definition standpoint, between a woodland and a savanna is what is making up the majority of biomass in the understory. A savanna would be a low basal area that has herbaceous. A woodland could be exactly the same structurally, but the biomass tends to be dominated by woody species. For a lot of wildlife species, it doesn't matter, but that's important for you to understand just the different terms that I'm using. So here we started in 2006, killed a bunch of trees in there. You can see this was a wildlife retention cut. So this right here, this line that you're seeing, we actually went in and used a chainsaw to ring that tree and then injected it with herbicide to leave it standing. You can see some of the other trees that was done to are laying on the ground. They're downed woody debris. You can see it's been burned a few times. It's being burned right now. and some of the snags had caught on fire, and it kind of changes the structure of that woody composition. But we can already see just 2 years after the initial treatments, we're getting quite a bit of understory response to that. Notice most of these are resprouting tree species, so the dominant cover in the understory is woody. So this is what we're talking about with woodland. You can see again, we've burned it 3 years later, and the year after that fire, you can see a lot of the dead stems that were in the understory. They got top killed by fire. Again, most of the biomass are from woody plant species, but this is already providing a tremendous amount of deer forage in reach. This actually is important. The reason I'm throwing that game species in there is because most of the people that are implementing this kind of treatment in upland hardwood stands are doing it because they like deer. All right, so we're benefiting a wide range of species with this practice, but we're getting people to adopt the practice by relating it to deer. All right, so that closed canopy stand that you saw beforehand, we would be getting about 25 pounds per acre dry weight of deer forage in that stand. And you can see the transformation that's been made. And not only that, the diversity of bird species that have responded to this is tremendous. All right, we're talking about probably 10 times the bird species using it. So here's the same stand a few years later, and we still have a lot of developed understory here. We're burning it every 3 years, and you can see that the stand has been maintained in this open canopy with a developed layer at the understory level. Notice I tripped over my words there. I almost said the herbaceous layer. You'll hear people say that term, but that would be technically incorrect here because most of the plant biomass are not herbaceous species. What they mean by that is the understory strata, and in a savanna, it may be the herbaceous layer, because in that case it would be dominated by herbaceous species. So just keep that in mind. So you can see now we're 12 years later, this thing, the canopy is starting to close. We're not getting as much sunlight in. This is approaching when we would think about re-entering the stand with another forest stand improvement to get that basal area down again. Generally, when you get up above 70% canopy cover, it's starting to limit the understory response. So remember that term. When the canopy is 70% or more intact, we start to limit the understory response. So we want to, when we're implementing these canopy reduction treatments, we want to get it way less than that because the trees are going to expand their canopy to fill in those gaps, right? So we want to have an extended period of time. In this case, we cut it down to about 40%, and it took about 12 years before we're getting up to that level where we're thinking about doing it again. It's a pretty long-term effect from the forest stand improvement, and we've maintained the vegetation response in the understory with repeated fire. So you can see here, now we've burned it 6 times since 2006, and we're still maintaining that vibrant understory strata. All right, so what's happened to this plant? Well, it's not a trick question. It's been burnt, right? It was top killed by fire, and you're looking at the resprouting part of it. By the way, you should know what this species is. It's summer grape. We're definitely going to learn that during the course. An important soft mass producing species, and when it's like this, it's a really high quality herbaceous or plant for herbivory. So herbivores really like it when it's resprouting. All right, what about this plant? So hopefully you already reviewed the document that we're getting, and you already have a good idea of what these are, but these are some important wildlife species. This one again has been top killed by fire, and it's resprouting. So this is Smilex, that genus, and this one in particular is a catbrier, but we're going to talk about this one quite a bit. Very important wildlife plant. and you can see it's resprouting after fire. All right, so here's another resprouting plant. You can see it's pretty aggressive here. We're actually collecting soil nutrients around it and picking the twig tips from these resprouts to look at the forage quality. And this one, again, you should know, is flowering dogwood. So you can see it's resprouting. So that's an important effect that fire is having on plants, is it's causing them to resprout. And we're going to talk about that more in a few minutes, but keep that in your head. All right, think about how long ago was the fire set in this picture? You can already see a lot of green coming back. I'll give you a minute to think about it. It's actually only about a week. That's pretty incredible, right? That it's already responded that much. These plants, this is wiregrass, a very highly adapted plant to deal with fire and actually promote the spread of fire in these systems. You can see how quickly it responds to fire. You should definitely ask Dr. Varner when he is lecturing in the class. He has an experiment where he was trying to measure with, I think actually with his children, how fast the wiregrass responds and the growth rate of it, which is pretty interesting. But I'm sure he'll have a good time telling you about that. All right, another thing, using information about fires is pretty common from law enforcement when we're trying to determine arson. So I'm going to ask you a couple more questions to think about. So what season was this set in? Was it growing season or dormant? There actually is enough information here for you to know. If you said growing season, you're correct. And notice this taller plant, this oak that's been top killed in the front of the picture, has leaves on it. So we know that that was actively growing during the fire. So there's information about what's happening in the system. What about this fire? What season was it set in? So based on that last one, you should have immediately noticed these hardwoods don't have leaves on them. So they were top killed during the dormant season. They weren't yet growing leaves. So kind of interesting to think about. You can also tell what direction the fire is going based on it'll go around trees. So there's sort of these little patches of vegetation behind the tree that kind of point the way that the fire went. So you can use that to find the ignition source. And there's all sorts of cool information like that in it. And it's really intriguing. And we usually have some students that are interested in law enforcement, and they're very interested in that kind of thing. So you can play crime scene investigator in that situation with some of these traits about how fire moves through. All right, so I'm going to show you this again. You've already seen it before. We're talking about lightning. Look at Florida. We're getting a lot of lightning, right? Especially in that little band through the center of the state. It really seems that way. Something that's really interesting about this, when we've had some historical accounts, and now we've had people reconstruct what portion of the United States was in an open forest condition that was savanna-like, right, or woodland, so savanna and woodland. And it's pretty interesting. If you laid that heat map over this one, it would actually look almost identical. So basically, the majority of the area that you can see that is in light green all the way to red or purple, in some cases in Florida, all of that was in open woodland for the most part, with the exceptions of the big river drainages like the Mississippi River, a couple of places up in the north near Wisconsin and Michigan. There were a couple of places that weren't open forest based on those the reconstruction of it. So it was pretty interesting how dramatic our landscape was affected. Now, A lot of that could have been from Native Americans. It probably was. The early European settlers also used fire frequently, so there was definitely human influence, but the distribution of flammable systems also matches remarkably well with the lightning, which obviously, when lightning strikes, it can generate fire. When you put that into context and look at it globally, actually, even Florida doesn't get that much lightning compared to some other places, particularly when we look at Africa through that center band. It's pretty incredible how much lightning occurs there in comparison to Florida. Here's something that's interesting for me. It puts things into perspective for how frequent we do get lightning in our systems here. So when I was a graduate student, I had a plot that was right here in the center of this picture, and you can't actually see the plot because the marks aren't where you can see it. But it was interesting to me because I was out trying to collect vegetation measurements, and an afternoon storm came through and ran us off of the plot because it was lightning. There was lightning in the storm, and this tree on the left was struck by lightning during that storm. So the next day we came back out, and I was admiring this new fire scar, or this new lightning scar, and same thing happened about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A storm brewed up, had lightning in it, so we got moved off of it again. And this was the third day I came back. I took this picture because it just really put things into perspective for me, that how frequent lightning was. So the tree on the right had been struck in the second storm, and both of these were right beside my plot. Another thing for you to realize is lightning doesn't always generate fire. So, lightning was an important ignition source, but that doesn't mean that lightning always sets fire. Obviously, this vegetation, even though it's very flammable with a lot of wiregrass that will even burn in the rain, uh, lightning doesn't necessarily always set fire. So it seems kind of silly, but we kind of I see us get into that mindset sometimes and forget that this is still a low probability occurrence, even when lightning's striking a lot. So the other way to look at it is you need lightning to strike a ton before you actually get enough fire to shape the landscape like we think it looked like. All right, so we talked a little bit about Native Americans burning. This was an important part of their culture, and they were doing it for a suite of different things, which are outlined here. These are some of the known ones. They probably were using it for other reasons, even if it was just to navigate the landscape. But one thing that we do know, and it's been kind of a centerpiece of my program, and I'll show you some data here, is they were taking advantage of the fact that fire creates a system that is very attractive for wildlife, especially directly after the fire has occurred. So some of the initial southern immigrants from European settlers, they used fire pretty commonly too, all the way up until the early 1900s. And they were using it for different reasons generally, more for grazing purposes, but we still had a lot of fire on the ground until until the suppression brigades came through and started trying to suppress it. So we'll talk about that more throughout the class, but uh, yeah. So there are lots of benefits. These are some that you see commonly uh, spoken about or talked about or presented on or researched. All of these things are associated with prescribed fire. The one that I focus on and that we're going to talk about most in this class, obviously, is the wildlife habitat, but there are lots of benefits that we see in these systems from this. One of the reasons that we keep going back to it is because the majority of animals in our systems here are adapted to frequent fire, and getting fire back on the ground is critical because of this for wildlife diversity. Most of those species that are really closely associated with fire, we would call those fire-assisted species. Those species are generally declining. Here are some of the really common fire-assisted vertebrates that we might be managing for in some of these systems. Probably be a good idea if you could select some of these out of a list. Something that people, especially people that aren't from the South, that are transplants, which is obviously pretty common in Florida. If you're, they're not used to fire being on the landscape, one of the common perceptions is that fire directly kills a lot of wildlife, and that's perpetuated by some of these mega fires that you see on the news channel, right? Like for instance, the mega fire that happened a couple of years ago in Australia that was, killed millions and millions of animals. That is a completely different thing than prescribed fire. Generally, with prescribed fire, killing wildlife is pretty rare. There are a couple of species that are considered exceptions, and that's the two that come to mind are box turtles and glass lizards. But there's actually been some pretty interesting research on box turtles. One of my predecessors actually, they actually were tracking these box turtles. They put these little trackers on their shell, and they actually would follow the little turtle and get a home range of it, and then schedule a burn in the block that it was in to see how the box turtle responded to it and whether or not it killed the turtle. And after a couple of years, they, and over 100 box turtles, only a couple were ever injured by it, and only, even less were actually killed by it. Those little guys, it was pretty crazy seeing some of the data presented on, because they would actually, this box turtle would have like a 2-acre home range that it spent all of its time in, all the way up until the moment that they started lighting things on fire. And I don't know if the box turtles were hearing them light it or smelling the smoke or something. I don't know what was cueing them in, but those box turtles, without fail, would take off running. It was, they would literally run into the next block or run down into a hole or a stump hole or something to get away from the fire, which was pretty incredible. The student that was tracking them, I talked to her about this a lot. It was she would actually be out there with the VHF and the beacon, keeping up with the box turtles to see what do they do when we start lighting. And it was just, she said, without fail, they would take off and they would get somewhere that protected them from it. So even it seems, based on her work, even that perception that they're commonly killed by prescribed fire is probably a misconception based on that work. And there have been a few other observation, studies like that since that have shown similar things. Another thing that you'll find, and we'll talk about this, and it'll probably come up a lot since Tall Timbers is so interested in ground nesting birds. You'll hear people talk about not burning at certain times because of ground nesting birds. And the fact of the matter is, these wildlife actually have really close association and adaptations with fire. And, they nest in the understory during the time that nature would have been burning, and they can deal with, losing a nest by re-nesting. That's very common. It's not that you necessarily want to try to burn up nests, but it's more to say they do have the capability of re-nesting, and it's pretty common that a lot of these bird species need the structure that happens right after fire to raise their nestlings or their poults or their chicks. All right, so the fire during that time frame may actually or does result in a net benefit, even if a few bird nests are consumed generally. Now, that's a scale dependent issue, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes, but definitely something to consider. That's not to say that wildlife never get killed by fire. If they come in contact with it, it can kill them, and particularly there are ways to increase the probability that wildlife are directly killed. Not that we would want to do that, but there are a few things that do ensure that that's more common, like increasing the spatial scale. Generally, if we get up to hundreds of acres being burned at a time, or even thousands, which is pretty common in some places with prescribed fire, we're starting to get to a level where direct mortality is probably more likely. All right. So another thing is there are some firing techniques, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, that can increase the probability. Namely, if you completely surround wildlife by fire, and particularly at larger scales, that can increase the direct mortality for things that can't fly or dig or go down underground. Most wildlife species are just, they move out of the way of fire, and they follow vegetation. So they return when vegetation starts to regrow. A lot of birds, that takes about a year of growing, but there are also a lot of birds that respond immediately, and we'll see this in the class if you're out in the field. You'll see a lot of birds in there eating the exposed seeds and the exposed insects. The short vegetation is really good for brooding because of those foods and the structure in there. A lot of species are scavenging the animals that did succumb to the fire, or scavenging insects, like I just said. Also, you'll see herbivores respond really quickly to the high quality food that is available with all the resprouting vegetation. So in general, fruit is positively influenced by fire, but here is a key aspect that you need to understand. In forested systems, light is limiting the benefits or the response of vegetation to the fire. And here is showing you data on that. Control in this case is a closed canopy stand that doesn't have fire. That's about what we would expect in terms of fruit. That's not much fruit per acre, right? If we add fire to that system, it will have no effect on the amount of fruit that is available in the understory, because light is limiting the system. Now, when we allow light with canopy reduction in, that causes a big flush in the production of fruit in the understory. And when we have both fire and the canopy reduction, we can augment that response and nearly double it again, right? And we can maintain that over a long time period with recurring fire. Cover looks exactly the same. Light is limiting the response, and once you have an adequate amount of light, then fire augments the effect of the light to increase this response. Generally, what you'll see is when you burn in these areas, you'll have the majority of high quality selected herbivore forage will be available in the first year, and that will kind of decline over time. In this system, if we're burning on a 3-year interval, you can see that we'll maintain really high forage production for that. This is also in a sandhill system, and it is water limited. So there's plenty of sunlight, but because it's sand, there's not much water. And you can see when we get down around the drainage in that system, the high water availability is allowing an even bigger response from the understory. So here's some interesting data about deer forage. Remember, I'm talking about game species because it facilitates adoption, but the same principles apply across the board for all those fire-assisted species, essentially. Control, that's what we expect without adequate sunlight. We can add fire into it, don't get much out of it. This is a shelter wood, which you should have a good idea of what that means now. Retention cut, that wildlife retention cut. You can see when we add fire in with the sunlight, we get a huge response in the understory vegetation. So the main thing for you to realize is that fire is affecting the seral stage and the structure and composition in some case of plant species, and animals are following the structure of those plants. All right, so let's see a real world example. So this is a property right here outlined in red, and notice all these green stars. Those are food plots and feeders that are designed to attract wildlife. Notice there aren't any on the property that we're going to do this case study with. This forest looked like this. Notice that there's very little vegetation in the understory here because the tree density is so high. This is very common in pine plantations to see it look like this. Even though it's being burned, you can see the fire, at least on some of these pines, you can see that black charring where fire has been coming through. Still not much vegetation because there's not enough sunlight. So in this system, we went in and did a variety of forest stand improvement practices where we broke the canopy up at different levels. And in some of them, we were using combinations of treatments with fire. In one case, we used herbicide to completely shift the understory toward herbaceous, and that's what you're seeing with the herbicide and fire in this. So notice on the picture on the left, you can see all of the dark gray, or when we've had herbicide and fire, the white means that it was just thinned. All right, so it just doesn't have fire in it. So there's still some vegetation responding to that. The black dots are actually camera traps, and we're going to monitor the response of wildlife to all these. This is a heat map generated by those camera traps of deer use right here, and you can see they're very closely related to the dark, or in other words, when fire is in the system, right? So we're getting a lot of sunlight into the stand, and fire is recurring. It's very strong attraction for deer. It would look like this just about for any species. Just to give you another example, this is from wild turkey. So they're very clearly, tightly linked to that habitat management practice. Even though there are all these anthropogenic subsidies in the environment designed to attract these animals, you can see, like, look up in the very top of this property, there are 2 subsidies right beside it, and it's still blue, right? They're still not using it very much, especially compared to the confluence of edges and these different managements in that T shape right there. So we have early succession mixed in with those different forest management strategies. They're all being burned frequently. And you can see how much that's influenced the use there. It, again, will look like this for virtually all of the fire-assisted species. The strong magnet effect. All right, so let's talk about scale of fire a little bit. So we can go down to pretty small acreages, so a 10-acre stand, and we still see this magnet effect happen. So if we followed 2 stands, and this would be before data, so no fire has been implemented, and then we go in and implement fire on one of them and not on the other, you can see the after here represents how much of an effect that fire has on their behavior. The reason that we're seeing these species respond is illustrated in this image right here, and you can see all of these invertebrates. There's a snail and a shield bug. There's also all of these acorns in this case that have been exposed, and we see this big response from a species that use those for food resources. We can get down to pretty small scales, and that still happens. Here's showing you data on deer responses, and these were at 1/4 of an acre, which is essentially a 30-yard radius, where we put you can see we put a camera on a tree, and then we have a 30-yard radius around it that we burned. And even at that really small scale, we still see this behavioral response from the wildlife species to it. So all of that was to say, we can burn at pretty small scales and still see a behavioral response from wildlife species, which shows how tightly coupled they are with fire. But it also is pretty important because it shows us that we can scale down and still benefit wildlife, as opposed to what we see very commonly because of a suite of constraints that are on our state and federal agencies in particular. We see them scaling up to make it more efficient, and we start to see some real problems with that. I'm going to attach a paper into the module for you to look at to show you that scale, but a lot of processes are actually negatively influenced, and a lot of species might be negatively influenced when we start getting up to really large spatial scales of fire. Even fire-assisted species, it starts to become a problem. So you'll see that in the paper that I've added, but you know, the take home is generally on private lands, people have more control over it, and they're more willing to implement fire at smaller scales. We tend to see more benefits to these wildlife species that we're trying to burn. All right, so we're going to talk about fire frequency a lot in the field portion of the course, but here's some pretty cool data. Notice, well, I'll just put it this way: study these graphs and kind of get an idea of how the periodic, which in this case is 3-year return interval, compares to the annual, and then based on the season. So some of the take-home messages for you to see is that the annual winter burning results in a lot of grass. Okay. Like it's nearly double the amount of grass than we would get from the annual summer burning. Another thing that is pretty interesting about this is the legumes in particular, and forbs, we see a lot more following the winter than the summer in that case as well. In the bottom graph, you can see a couple of other things. The hardwood species abundance in the understory is really well controlled by the annual burning, and then they're almost non-existent in the annual summer burning. All right, so the frequency of fire matters a lot, and the season of the fire also matters a lot. All right, so here is a key to understanding all of this. Notice the dormant season fires, the annual summer burning results in fewer forbs and legumes. That is because the summer burning in this study was done in the early summer. All right, so it was like an April time frame. If we move that fire to the midsummer or late in the summer, that better mimics some of these natural processes, we would end up with a much higher proportion of forbs and legumes. And if there is also soil disturbance involved, then the amount of forbs that are in that community would skyrocket. All right, so I'm going to show you some examples of that in the class, but very important for you to put that into context. All right, so we said earlier that fruit generally responds favorably to fire if there's enough sunlight, right? So if there's not enough sunlight, fire's not going to make a difference. However, if you're burning extremely frequently, that's not necessarily the case. So a lot of these plants need some time to put on enough plant biomass to then flower, these perennial plants. And if you're burning on a 1-year return interval, which would be signified by the 0 here, based on this, we would expect that we may not have any fruit. Well, others have suggested that that's not necessarily the case, because we also have less fuel, so the fire spread would be less intense and less complete. And based on this 3-year interval, which you're looking at right here, even though most of the fruit are being produced at the end of the cycle in the 3rd year before it'd be burned again, there has been a lot of suggestion that the more frequent fire would still promote this really high fruit abundance. So I did an experiment during my graduate studies to test that hypothesis, and actually compared fruit production in a 1-year interval versus a 2-year interval versus a 3-year interval. So that's how frequently the fire's coming back. If we get to go in the Stoddard plots, you'll get to visually see this, because they have this experiment. This is actually one of the longest experiments on the planet, where they've done this 1 versus 2 versus 3-year interval. And you can see the 3-year interval, you get quite a bit of fruit in those stands compared to a 2-year interval or a 1-year interval. All right, so the point here is the frequent fire is really beneficial for a suite of things, but if you only do the frequent fire, you're going to lose things from it. The diversity in fire return interval is pretty important. Okay, so the timing of fire can be pretty critical, and particularly that late summer fire and disturbance that we talked about with the bison following after the soil disturbance. Well, the same thing is still true with just having late growing season burning. So here's a couple of graphs showing you the differences that we should expect in undesirable plant cover, and that's woody plants in this case, so woody encroachment on these systems. So if you have a September burn, the control of those stems is similar to that of some of the common herbicides that we would use. So we can actually use fire just as effectively in that time frame as herbicides to control undesirable hardwood cover. That's pretty cool that we could use fire at that time instead of herbicide to accomplish the same thing, and you actually get a lot out of it that you wouldn't in terms of that legume cover. So remember, I just talked about, I gave you context with that other study. Notice on the previous slide, notice that early growing season March burn here is still not resulting in much legume cover, but the September burn is resulting in more than double the coverage of legumes than any of the other treatments that were in this study. So timing is a pretty important aspect for what you get out of the plant community response. Okay, so let's go right on to the herbivore. And what you're looking at right here, and I mean the herbivore interacting with fire. So what you're looking at right here is called a Keach-Byram index, and it's basically just a measure of drought. This is from a common tower that's used over in the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. And what I want you to notice is the timing of drought. This red line, the bold red line, is actually the nutritional demands of deer in the southeast. And that, there are some situations where it doesn't look like this. For instance, in South Florida, the fawning is not co-occurring with green up. It is actually being driven by when water is not a limiting factor. So, but for most of the southeast, the nutritional demands of the herbivore look pretty similar to this red line. It's remarkably similar to drought, right? Why would they have the peak nutritional demands co-occur with when it's droughty and when the peak in lightning occurs? All right, so this is just showing you when lightning is happening. So remember when I was talking about the fire herbivore interaction in the disking lecture, and we talked about summer, midsummer fires were occurring, and then the herbivore activity occurred right after that. Well, now we can see the nutritional demands of the herbivore are actually coinciding with when fire is occurring. So remember, this is basically the plant phenology is starting to taper off, and it's droughty. Why in the world would they have the peak demands occurring right at the end unless fire had something to do with it? So if you actually look at when we light prescribed fire, I think I've already shown this one time. Remember, we like to light it during the early part of the year, and even when we're using growing season, that's still generally April or May, whereas lightning is setting things on fire more during the middle of the summer, with the exception of some systems, especially in Florida, that those lightning ignited fires may occur more toward May, but you can still see that they are not the same. And remember, we're talking about timing is pretty important. So let's think about what's happening with forage production in these systems. So if you look at the natural green up cycle without fire being implemented, that would look like this dark green right here. All right, so we'd have a spring green up when everything is good. We have what we call a late summer stress period. The reason that occurs is because the quality of plants is naturally declining through the summer as they go to flower and produce seed and senesce. Yet that is still when herbivores' nutritional demands peak. So why would they do that? Why would they have their young at the poorest time? It's dry, and that's after the green up pulse has happened. And then let's look at if we lit fire where this guy's standing right here during March, when we do, the green that you just saw overlay is the phenological progression of quality following that fire. So you've top killed all those plants, and they all flushed, but it all co-occurred with green up, so we don't end up with any benefit. So what about if we light it during May or June when green up is in full force? What will happen, or what should happen, is we should basically wipe away all that green up by top killing all those plants. And because those plants have been top killed and then they have to green up again, not only is that delayed, but they also have much shorter of a window to grow to the same canopy and produce the same flowers and seeds. They have less time to do that, so they should overcompensate. So you should have this big nutritional pulse in the plant community if that is what's occurring. It is indeed what's happening. So now you're looking at real data where you're looking at the proportion of plant parts that are browser selected. Notice this giant bar right here in July that's sticking out. That is following a June fire. So now we have this huge pulse that co-occurs with the nutritional demands of the herbivore. So here's real data from a project I just got published. Actually, I need to update that citation. We just got this published showing that in a sandhill community that's really poor for deer, if there's no fire occurring, the average plant does not meet the nutritional requirements for a doe with one fawn. So that line that you're seeing at about 2,500 milligrams per kilogram of phosphorus, that's what she needs to support lactation for one fawn. The part where we're between the two diamonds, that is the window of time in this system that she needs to meet that. This doesn't mean she can't meet lactation requirements. It just means the average plant doesn't meet those requirements. So she has to be extremely highly selective of what plants she eats. So if we have fire occurring in February, kind of at the onset of the prescribed fire season, look and see it makes no difference in terms of the quality of the plants for this lactating doe. If we move that forward to April, toward what most people are calling that growing season window, even when we're doing more ecological and using growing season fire, we tend to focus right there. You can see still no effect in terms of the quality. All of that pulse and nutrients that we would expect following fire is occurring before the animals actually need it. If we set that fire during June, now the average plants in the community now exceed her nutritional requirements. And I'm using phosphorus here because that generally is a limiting nutrient to herbivores in these systems. The same thing happens though in other nutrients. Anything that's mobile in the plant is actually occurring very similar to that. Another pretty cool thing that's happening in this system is this horizontal line here, the dotted line, is just showing you preference. So if the bar is taller than that, that means that the herbivore is preferring that plant. Notice that the Acer, Carya, and mesophyte just means plants that are mesophytic, and in other words, they don't like fire. They're being top killed by fire. Notice that all three of those groups, when we have that growing season fire, so the gray bar represents that June time frame, when we light fire and those plants are resprouting to that, now they're just as preferred as the things we typically think of as preferred, like greenbrier, that's the smilax, or blackberry, that's rubus here. Now we have transformed those plants because of that nutrient pulse, and it's exaggerated particularly in mesophytic species. Those plants are now just as high preference as the things that we think of as the highest quality plants on the landscape and highest preference plants. So we've actually transformed, based on just the timing of the implementation, we've transformed what is actually preferred as food. That's pretty cool, right? That also has a pretty important impact on the plant communities, because the plants are not just withstanding fire, they're also having to deal with the subsequent herbivory. And notice the growing season fire, that's that June fire again, where now we have just as much biomass of legumes as we have of trees in the system, which is a far different from these other treatments. Notice how much notice how tall the gray bar is, and that's basically a dormant fire with no deer involved. We actually increase the amount of tree biomass in the system by burning. All right, so we're usually using fire to try to decrease tree biomass, and in this case we would actually increase it if we applied it and we didn't have deer, because deer are controlling the biomass response because they are browsers, right? They're eating biomass. In particular, the growing season with deer, look how much that's suppressing. So that's that green bar on the tree thing. We have an enormous impact on trees, because not only does the tree not respond well, that's the blue bar, excuse me, Um, yeah, the blue bar. The blue bar is just showing you what the impact of fire itself is on the tree. So notice we've decreased the biomass to about half, and then that decreases even further to about a quarter. So we have fire and herbivory are interacting to suppress woody plants when it is growing season fire, particularly. So the deer, in other words, the deer is playing an important role in the vegetation response and in the control of undesirable species in the system. All right, so here's showing you some other data. This is just showing you that traumatic shift in preference. So a seedling that that has not been top killed, the white bars indicate the preference by deer. The gray bars show you how preference changes for that same species. So black gum is fairly high preference as a seedling, just as it is. It's actually the highest of our woody plants, and you can see that goes to 1. So basically all of them are browsed after fire if there are deer around. And you can see some of these things that are undesirable, like water oak, wingdown, red maple, even sweet gum. Sweet gum and red maple were not even eaten as seedlings. And now after burning during that summer time frame, top killing those, we have transformed uh, the perception of the animal for those, and they end up suppressing those undesirable species as a result of the interaction. All right. So not only does the fire herbivore interaction is that important for when we were talking about disking with that hoof action, if it was a giant herbivore, but now with our herbivore that's still in the system, they're playing an important role when the timing of fire and that interaction is correct. They're playing a critical role in suppressing the undesirable invading species through herbivory interacting with fire. So pretty cool, and showing you that deer can have a really big impact on the system, and in this case, a really positive impact on the system. We typically think of herbivores as being a nuisance, especially if you're thinking about from a forestry perspective, and that's just not always the case. Herbivory is a natural part of the system, and it can play an important role in suppressing some of these undesirable species. So what is going on in the plant? Well, one of my former graduate students, Carol Baruzzi, and I did this experiment where we manipulated the root to shoot ratio of plants in pots. And we did that by doing all different kinds of potting designs. So it was a really cool experiment. But basically, what we were able to show in that is that the more so when you top kill a plant, let's back up. When you top kill a plant, it has this enormous root system under the ground, right? And now it has no biomass above ground. So when you top kill that plant, the plant responds by reallocating where it stores its nutrients. And because the above ground biomass is far less, or is in a skewed ratio to the root biomass now, it ends up upregulating the concentration of nutrients, because it's still trying to store the same amount of nutrients above and below ground, but it has far less biomass above ground to do that. So it responds by super concentrating these nutrients. This same relationship is shown in other nutrients that are mobile in the plant. That is probably why we see this big magnet effect on herbivores. So here's showing you the magnet effect now. This is just species in general. It applies to herbivores, turkeys, a variety of bird species, anything that's eating seeds, vegetation, or dead insects, or the flushing insects after the flushing vegetation. It will look like this. All of them have a magnet effect. So what we would expect with the use of this area would be that gray bar without fire. If we apply a March fire, notice we have this big pulse in use. This is real data from wildlife responding. So if we burn in March, about 8 weeks later, we're going to have a peak in use in May. The same thing occurs if we burn in June. About 6 to 8 weeks later, we're going to have this big pulse in use, and that lasts on through the end of the growing season. If we did it during mid-August, we would see a pulse in use in September and October. So it's kind of a sliding scale of things responding to this fire. We have the removal of vegetation, and that exposes seeds and a bunch of insects, and it also causes a flush in vegetation, and all of those different things culminate into a behavioral response by wildlife. So here's just showing you some of the things that are happening. This is after a growing season fire. These are blackberries, and they have been cooked. And if you've ever eaten blackberry pie, you can understand why wildlife might want to respond to that. So when we're talking about the timing, so not only do you, if you burn during the growing season, do you release all those fruits, but look at the bars here, particularly the dormant versus the growing season. You can see, like I talked about in the former lecture, with management affecting the timing of resources relative to the bird migrations. So you can see that same thing, but what I want to direct your attention to now with this graph that you've already seen before is the UH. Now that's upland hardwood, and basically the upland hardwood are little patches of hardwoods that are dispersed throughout a longleaf ecosystem. So we kind of have this approach that we tend to get blinders on, and we think about the longleaf pine ecosystem as having nothing but longleaf, and that's just not true. We know from a variety of data sets that upland hardwoods, there are some species even that are endemic to that system, but they are a native part of the system, and they typically occur in fire shadows. And because of the way they interact with fire, you end up with these little patches of unburned area, even in the year of burning. And because the fire doesn't progress through the system, it progresses in a mosaic, and that's why you're seeing this really large thing. The fire is progressing through the system in a mosaic. Here's another benefit of the growing season fire compared to, oh, by the way, with the upland hardwoods, that's following growing season fire. The shade that's being provided by some of those hardwoods is still an open canopy, but because of the variation in shade and lighting conditions and fuel conditions associated with that, you end up with that mosaic of fire spread. But here, let's look at the responses of tick populations. So notice dormant season fire. So when we like to light fire during March, that has no effect on the tick abundance. But we have a catastrophic decline in the number of ticks in the environment following a growing season fire, and that's a June time frame here in this experiment. We also did an experiment where we just fenced out deer and dormant season fire as well. And fencing out deer, so a lot of people think that increasing deer populations are responsible for this increase in tick abundance, but here in this experiment we're showing that's not the case. Fencing out deer for years did not result in a lower tick density, even if we added fire into the system. So pretty interesting. The timing can make a big difference, and I don't know about you, but I'm all about having fewer ticks in the environments I'm walking around in. So here is a cost comparison. Prescribed fire is extremely cost effective, and it is much more cost effective than many other practices. And even if you compare it to some things that most landowners are doing for deer, like planting summer food plots, those are the last three at the bottom, the prescribed fire is still more cost effective than those practices. Another thing that I run into all the time, and particularly if you get up in the northeast or the central hardwoods regions, there is this perception that you should not burn in upland hardwoods, and that comes from a bunch of different places, but uh, the main one is this idea that it's going to damage the overstory trees. And here I'm just showing you some images of the type of fires. So at bottom left, we're using low intensity fires in these systems. The top left and the top right show you tree boles from these oaks. They are completely unaffected by this fire. However, the bottom right is showing you the instance where the damage would occur. So if you have a lot of large fuel on the ground, like the dead limbs or dead trees or something associated with things that you've been doing in there, if those catch fire near the tree, then that's where the damage comes from. So there's this really strong perception that you shouldn't burn in hardwoods, and I've shown you a variety of data to show why you might want to. And even here, we can see that you can do it really effectively. You just have to take care to remove trees around desirable stems in the overstory if you don't want them to be damaged. So we've talked a little bit about mosaics, but here's just showing you the kinds of mosaic that you might get. Having cover interspersed with the released resources that are associated with fire is really beneficial. So there's actually two types of mosaics. We call one an invisible mosaic and then the other an actual mosaic. So notice here we have a grid of 6 burn units. Those 6 units, we've checkerboarded it, and we have 3 places that we've actually ignited fire. So we're controlling where fire is by controlling where the ignition source starts. So that would be called an invisible mosaic. Okay, I don't know why they chose that term, but essentially the invisible mosaic is the mosaic that's happening at at a larger scale because you're putting fire in different places. So there's a mosaic and vegetation structure across these 6 units simply because we chose to burn in 3 of them and not to burn in the other 3. That's called the invisible mosaic. The actual mosaic is the mosaic that's caused by the way that fire spreads. So you can see particularly in this lower left unit, that strip of green vegetation and then all those splotches of green, that was created because of the way that fire moved through the system after it was ignited. So that'd be the actual mosaic. So make sure you understand those terms. In either case, the mosaic or the diversity and structural conditions of the vegetation are really critical for us to be considering when we're trying to manage and maximize the effectiveness of these management strategies. So we're going to talk a lot about this in the field, but just so that you have a good idea of different kinds of fire. So we call fire different things based on how we ignite the fire relative to the wind direction. Make sure that you understand these things. These 4 right here are the really common firing techniques that we would use. The first thing that you would light when you ignite a fire is called a test fire, and we generally would do that on one of the corners on the downwind side. So you can see this backing fire here. We would have first in one of the corners on the stand, in this case because of the slight canter of the wind, we would have lit the test fire on the bottom right corner because that is the where all the wind is pushing toward. So we would light the test fire to test the behavior and make sure everything is igniting the way that we want, and then we would basically go across the stand from the lower right corner to the lower left corner lighting the fire to create a black line. This is called a backing fire. The reason it's called a backing fire is because the fire spread is moving directly into the wind. All right. The flanking fire, we would be pulling fire directly toward the wind, and then it sort of peels off from there. That would be a more intensive technique than the backing fire. It burns a little faster and a little bit hotter. We can also have a couple of different things where we're basically creating head fires. So a head fire means that the fire is moving with the wind. It's heading with the wind. It tends to be much faster and a much higher intensity. So a strip heading fire would be a technique where we would just draw the fire all the way across the stand in a continuous line. We might move out, 10 or 15 or 20 yards from your backing fire, and it's a way to control the intensity of the fire, but it's moving a little bit faster because we're using the wind to push the fire. The spot fire, that's a little less intense version where we're still creating head fires, but we're allowing fire to spread in every direction with spots throughout the stand. So these are all pretty common, and there are ways that we can use fire to control the intensity and burn safely in these environments. If you were to completely basically run a backing fire and then a flanking fire up each side, and then you run a strip head fire along the north end of these blocks, that would create what we would call a ring fire. That is generally a firing technique that we never want to use from a wildlife standpoint, because it traps wildlife inside the lines, and particularly if that's done at large scales, it can be really problematic and cause an increase in probability of mortality from the fire. So we generally try to avoid that. Here's a pretty cool depiction just showing you they've lit their backing fire on the far end of the stand. You can see the smoke off in the background, and now they've lit a flank fire, which is coming down the fire break toward us, and then you can see where they've started a strip head fire and where they pulled it straight out into the stand from left to right. And notice the way that the smoke is going. That's how you can tell which type of fire it is, and you can see how quickly that is engulfing fuel relative to those other firing techniques, right? That fire is moving much faster because the wind is helping it. So, all right, I'm going to conclude here with fire, but we're going to again cover fire to a great extent in the course because it's so important to our systems. And I know that it was probably tough to listen to this whole thing, but hopefully you enjoyed learning about all the ways that we can use fire creatively to benefit wildlife.